Hi guys, today I'll be taking a look at a heavy clicky switch, the Kailh BOX Pale Blue. Let's get started. Now, the Pale Blue is part of the Kailh BOX Heavy lineup, which consists of 3 switches, a linear, tactile and clicky variants. Sometimes you may even see them being called the Novelkeys x Kailh BOX Heavy switches, as they are a collaboration with Novelkeys. Additionally, you may have also guessed that this is the heavier version of the Kailh BOX White, and you would be right. Now, pricing wise, these are $10.80 for 36 switches on Novelkeys, so they're very affordable, especially if you're into heavier switches. And this is what they look like when disassembled. Feel free to pause the video. Now, let's move on to the switch categories. On-center key presses are ultra smooth with no obvious binding or scratchiness. I couldn't even detect any inconsistencies, which is impressive. Off-center key presses, however, are much less impressive, with scratchiness and binding present across most switches, and it's more apparent on stabilized keys. Overall, it's pretty much perfect in one area, but not in another. 6 out of 10. Now, according to Kailh, these switches have an actuation force of 60 grams at 1.8mm and a bottom-out force of 80 grams at 3.6mm. Here is a side-by-side comparison against the Kailh BOX White, its lighter counterpart, and as you can see, the Pale Blue is slightly heavier. Now, in practice, this is exactly how it feels, a heavier Box White, and that's all it really needed to be, unlike some other switches. However, because it's a Kailh switch, there are still inconsistencies present, but at least they aren't as bad as other Kailh switches. Overall, these just feel more correct and balanced, unlike the 2 previous switches I reviewed. 8 out of 10. Now, when it comes to sound, I like it. I've always been a big fan of click bar switches, and this is no exception. They sound wonderful and very crisp. The closest rival to them is the Cherry MX Green, which is a click jacket switch, and let me tell you, these are much better sounding. However, they are still both quite high pitched. Overall, I like how they sound, especially with my setup. 7 out of 10. Now, take a listen and enjoy. Now, let's start with the downsides when it comes to typing. Firstly, just like the Box White, these switches have the same issues, namely it also has a click to mismatch actuation, which isn't as commonplace in click jacket switches from my experience, so no, click bars aren't perfect in everything. Although with that said, the Pale Blue isn't as badly mismatched as these NEC Novel Blue switches. These are truly the worst. The Pale Blue is still usable in this case. Secondly, whilst the inconsistencies weren't as bad as previous Kailh switches, they are still present on this switch, and even small amounts of it is detectable when you're typing at speed, since that's where you'd most likely notice it. Now, onto the good points, as this is essentially just a heavier Box White, I slightly like them more, and I do like the fact that the only thing that was changed was the weighting, just how it's supposed to be in my opinion. Overall, I like it. It's a heavier Box White, nothing more, nothing less. 7 out of 10. Now, there's a reason why many gaming keyboards these days are only offered in linear or tactile switch variants. Clicky switches aren't suited to most gaming scenarios, that includes this switch. However, the Pale Blue performed more than adequately for me, plus the slightly heavier weighting made sense as I prefer heavier weighted switches. All in all, it's not a bad switch for gaming. The biggest letdown is of course its clicky nature. It's fine-ish for more intense games where you're not really paying attention to your keyboard, but when it comes to quieter, movie-like games, the clicking in the background becomes more of an annoyance than anything. Overall, it's obviously not designed for gaming, although it's still a strong performer despite that, and that's why I like it. But they wouldn't be my top choice. 7 out of 10. In conclusion, it's simple. It's a heavier Kailh BOX White switch. Nothing more, nothing less. It's one of the heavy alternatives that I can actually recommend, unlike the two previous switches. The final score for this switch is 35 out of 50 or 70%, making this the first clicky switch to hit the 70% mark. And that's the end of the review, and next time I'll be looking at something completely different. Until then, take care and goodbye.